My name's David Corlett, and I'm chairing this session, obviously. Now we have here two authors who have written books about Sri Lanka, about Sri Lanka's bloody civil war. In her book, Tamil Tigress, Sydney writer Niromi de Soyza writes about the early years as the hostilities were building, and then details what it was like to live through and to participate in the civil war as a teenage Tamil tiger. Her account is an honest reflection of the allure of the tigers, the capacity of a young woman to see some things clearly, but also to deny some things, and the emotional upheavals that accompany both the thrill and the trauma of war. Niromi's book tells a story of a tragedy, really, as does Frances Harrison's. Frances is a foreign correspondent who's worked for the BBC in various parts of the world, including from 2000 to 2004 as the resident correspondent in Sri Lanka. Frances's book, Still Counting the Dead. In Frances' book, we fast forward 2 decades from Niromi's work and then learn about the final days or the final months of the bitter civil war. The Tamil Tigers, which once controlled large swathes of the small island, are on the brink of defeat, and the Sri Lankan government forces are gunning for total victory. What eventuates is a bloodbath. Countless Tamil civilians are killed, deliberately and needlessly. The extent of human suffering is actually mind-blowing. And I think we'll hear a bit more later about it's even greater in some ways than what Frances was able to document in her book. Frances' book situates itself with the victim, and it calls to account not only the Sri Lankan government, but also the Tamil Tigers, who, while espousing liberation for the Tamil people, treated them also with murderous disdain. Both books, I think, are devastating reads and raise serious questions, not only about the things that happened in Sri Lanka. They're essays, I think, in the reality of war. They speak of the human capacity for brutality and about the brutalising effects of that. They also raise questions, I think, about the international community's interest in and commitment to human rights, and particularly those issues in an age of global terrorism. So, welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thanks, David.
I wonder whether we should start at the beginning, and that's with you, Niromi. I wonder whether you might tell us something about the Tamils in Sri Lanka and about why some of them at least have felt the need to take up arms. Maybe you can read something as well.
Thanks, David. Thank you all for giving up your time and come to listen to us. Because Sri Lanka is a small place and not many people know about it or even interested. But I do appreciate that you all come to learn something or just confirm something today. Well, Tamils are a minority in Sri Lanka, so it's a struggle between minority and majority Sinhalese. I grew up in a very ordinary family. I was born in the south where it's a majority Sinhalese. I was not born in the north where it's the Tamil stronghold, as they'd call it. And I had a very normal childhood, which I thought was quite wonderful, actually, because we had, my parents were of sort of mixed heritage, because my dad is from the north, he's a Tamil, and my mum's also a Tamil, but she had Indian heritage. And, we had lots of Sinhalese friends. We grew up in a fairly normal environment until I started to realize something wasn't right. And in 1977, I think there was some upheaval, which I was very, very young to understand. And my parents made a fatal decision to send us to Jaffna so that we will be safer, which is a Tamil stronghold. So once I was there, it seemed normal, although I didn't particularly warm up to the place. It was very hot, like today, all the time. But it was a very stifling environment. But, I got on and suddenly started to realize things were not so normal. And as a very bookish child, I was quite shocked into reality when I was about 13 years old. The state library was burned down by the government forces. And to me, that was just the turning point, I think, for a young child to see something, like that to happen, because a library, why would somebody burn down a library? And to me, it was a symbol of oppression. It was a Tamil, an ancient library that had lots of ancient Tamil literature. And then I started to realize that things were different, that I needed to understand this a bit more. But then, being a child, you just carry on with your normal self. And 1983, everything changed, because not far from where I was, the Tamil Tigers, I used to think they were bank robbers or something like that, until they ambushed an army patrol and killed 13 soldiers, which had a huge impact for the whole country, because the entire Tamil population, not just in Jaffna, but all through the country, suffered for it. There was an anti-Tamil pogrom, and since then, refugees had started to flood to all around the world. And to me, one of the things I find it surprising to this day, that the countries were accepting refugees, so they obviously knew there was something wrong, that these people were suffering persecution, and yet nobody did anything. So one way they're accepting, there is problems in Sri Lanka. In other ways, everything, they carried on as it didn't happen outside. So, and things just got worse for us. Gradually, civil war broke out, and my normal going to school day every day, we didn't have school much, and then there was random artillery shelling, and the Tigers became strong, because after 83, a lot of young men went and joined the Tigers, because they just thought that was the only way to do it. But not women, because at that time, they were politically involved, but in a society like Sri Lanka, women are fairly conservative, or we are expected to be. So, it wasn't a thing that we would just go up and pick up a gun and start fighting. But by the time I was 16, things just got so bad that I spent a lot of time in the bunkers. There were home-built bunkers, but I was still studying for my school exams, thinking, well, just in case there was an exam, I don't want to miss out. I needed to keep at it. So I was fairly studious, as most Tamil children are expected to. You all have to become doctors.
Can I just interrupt you?
Sorry.
I'm wondering I'm wondering if the audience actually understands what it was like to grow up. What did you see and feel as a child in that period?
Well, initially it seemed like things were happening to other people in a distant place, because you could hear gunshots, you heard artillery shell dropping close to the perimeters of an army camp. And then gradually, as army would gain territory, the shells started to fall everywhere, and then the army would go on patrols, and people would be taken out of their homes, shot, young children. And I think I started to get a bit scared. I thought, well, they could just walk into my house and murder my whole family and rape us, because that was something that we expected. They expected to be raped as young women. And so I started to get really scared, and gradually, you'll see it in the early parts of the book. I will constantly try and eavesdrop into conversations of the adults, because nobody will answer us. In Sri Lanka, it's one of those things that children don't question authority or adults. And so if I say, they'll say, just go do your homework, that sort of thing. So, and I could see that they were scared and they were helpless and they didn't know what to do themselves. And I think that started a complete change in my attitude, thinking that maybe we all have to do something for ourselves, because you can't rely on other people. No one's going to save us, because we could see the international community wasn't going to come in to save us. So I thought, well, it looks like I'm going to die. I'd rather do something and die than just be dead in a bunker as nobody. So, I'm sorry.
Sure. Maybe I'll ask Francis something. So the situation was awful for Tamils. We're talking about the 1980s here. And then a couple of decades later, you go to Sri Lanka. What was happening then?
Well, when I lived in Sri Lanka, when I first went, there was full-scale war, but the Tigers by that stage had actually gained territory. They moved on from being a sort of guerrilla movement at the time when Niromi was with them to actually controlling a large portion of the north and the east of the island and running effectively a de facto state. They had their own police, their own court system, their own administration, they took taxes from people, so they ran a small state of their own. And they were still at war, so around the boundaries there was fighting, but there was a kind of territory that they controlled in the northeast of Sri Lanka. And when I went there, most of the time when I lived in Sri Lanka, I was a BBC correspondent, I was based in Colombo, there was a peace process, which meant that actually for the first time, journalists from the south could go and see the Tigers, interact with them, meet them, get to know them. And so that's what I spent most of those 3 years of the peace process doing. And I found it fascinating, to see, how they operated, because reporting on them long distance was really frustrating. And, you would write about them every day without actually ever seeing a tiger, except in London or Paris. So, when I first went to the Vani, the area that they controlled, it was like going to the moon, for me. It was so different from the south. There is poverty in the south of Sri Lanka, but nothing on the scale of what there was there, because the government controlled the area, the perimeter of the area, and so didn't allow medicine, food, didn't allow things into that area. They had a strict economic embargo. So you went in and you found children sitting on ammunition boxes, studying in schools where there were no windows, but shell holes everywhere and bullet marks everywhere. And you went to the hospital and you found people who'd lost limbs, because of landmines. And you met the demining team and you found that they were doing it with a metal fork, the demining. It was so un-high-tech. It was shocking. And the doctors didn't have enough medicines. It was poverty on an appalling scale. It would take you hours and hours and hours on these appalling bumpy roads even to get to the main town. There were no hotels, there were no restaurants. It was completely, underdeveloped.
And different from what you would have expected? So, the difference between reporting on a place from distance and then being able to get into that place?
Yes. It's difficult to explain, but it was quite different. I just didn't know what it would look like physically, what the level of facilities would be, how friendly the tigers would be to us. We had no idea until we went there.
And then the book is actually not about that period. The book is about some years later, as the war escalates, really.
That's right. Well, I watched the very end of the war from London, and I thought I'd finished with Sri Lanka and put it to bed, as it were. I went on to another story. I went to Iran, but I couldn't kind of get away from it in London because, first of all, a lot of Sri Lankan journalists turned up in exile, people I'd been in press conferences with and knew and wanted help in London, and from them I understood that there was still something kind of ongoing that was pretty awful. And then I also talked to one of the senior Tigers right through the end of the war on Skype and satellite phones and so on, which was quite rare. They didn't have that much contact with the outside world. Which I talk about. Yeah. And so I was connected again to the story in a way. I couldn't get away from it. And what I understood at the time was that something really awful had happened. I knew that from watching the videos that came out, some of the news coverage, from talking to people. And then, of course, when everybody came out of the war and the survivors, and they were all put in a massive detention centre, a huge refugee camp, the second biggest city in Sri Lanka at the time, it was so huge. I knew that something awful was happening there. You got reports that women were being abused, that people were disappearing, and I knew enough to know that something rather sinister was happening. But until I started to research this book, I had no idea how dreadful it was. It was only when I sat down with the first survivor from this war in London and talked to her for days on end that I began to understand quite how shocking it was. And the first interviewee, I thought, wow, I found this amazing story, it's so shocking. And then the next one was worse, and the next one the same. And basically, after a while, I realized that anybody you spoke to who'd come out of this war had a tale of survival that was extraordinary. It was for me, it felt a bit like talking to Holocaust survivors, except that nobody even knew that this had happened or acknowledged it.
Yeah, well, you raised a couple of issues there that would be good to talk further about. One is what you describe is sort of the scale of the violence that was occurring, and that we didn't know, or that those of us who knew didn't seem to care. I wonder if you can talk a bit about those two things, about the scale and why it is that it wasn't broadly publicised, and maybe there's something you could read to help us understand.
Mm-hmm. Well, the scale, I mean, the Norwegian peace mediator in the peace process in Sri Lanka, Erik Solheim, recently said in London that this is probably the worst bloodshed of the 21st century. I mean, everybody's heard of Srebrenica, but nobody's heard of Mulavikel, which is where many more people died in 2009. So on a scale, I mean, if you take the figures from the United Nations who've looked into this, there's a panel of experts who looked at it, they said it was quite credible that 40,000 civilians had died in this 5-month period. And we're talking about an area that's minuscule. I mean, Sri Lanka's not a big island, and this is a very, very small area that the Tigers and civilians were crammed into. So for the most part, it was around 35 square kilometers, and it shrank to even, 9, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, as it got towards the end of the war. So you're talking about civilians, hundreds of thousands of civilians crushed into this tiny area, being pounded by supersonic jets, shells, heavy artillery, multi-barrel rocket launchers. So it was carnage on a pretty dreadful scale. One of the recent UN reports said that it was possible that 70,000 people died there. And it's upped the death count really substantially since I finished the book. And if that's the case, then we're talking about something on the scale of Syria, but condensed in speed into just 5-6 months, whereas Syria's been going on, 18 months, 2 years. So, really that's unprecedented to have that kind of killing in recent years. So speedily and so fast, and then to find nobody knows about it. Why does nobody know about it? Because the Sri Lankan government ensured that there were no independent witnesses there. They stopped journalists, aid workers, UN staff from going inside. They intimidated anybody who spoke out. They threatened them, they blackmailed them, they harassed them. And there were Tamil witnesses who spoke about it, who sent information out, but they weren't believed. They were considered to be partisan, biased. And I think the UN also failed in a major way, and that's been documented actually now by the UN itself. And they talked about how there were grave failures in Sri Lanka, and that several senior UN staff simply didn't see the protection of civilians as their duty or their responsibility. So this is from the UN, it's not just me saying this. And so many people believe this is Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, his Rwanda moment in a way.
Yes.
So yeah, why didn't people know about it? And now they do know. It's quite frustrating for people like me who have, researched it, that it's not taken as seriously as it should be, because this sets a precedent for other countries to get away with the same sort of thing. They breached every law on war. And if people don't even take note, then another country can do it in another place.
And I'd like to come back to that because I think it's a really key issue, and I'd like to come back to the end. How are you going there, Niromi?
No, I'm all right.
Are you all right?
Sorry about that.
No, that's completely fine. Are you up for me asking you some further questions?
Yeah.
I guess there were early signs, I think, in your experience with the Tigers that they weren't quite as pure as you might have hoped. That there were moments along the journey where I think there was pause for thought, where you were witness to some actions on the part of the Tigers that you felt uncomfortable about, and I think there's a couple of examples that you may or may not want to talk about. But I'm wondering if you can talk about what was going on for you as a child, as a young woman, and what it was. Yeah, so what was going on for you as a child, where you could both, see the value in a group that was about providing safety for Tamils, but also could see some of the problems, but you sort of needed to overlook them to stay involved.
Yeah, and I think that is an issue that all Tamils faced. It's one of those things that you sort of think, you look at the greater good is the way you justify it, because of course, these are young people who have taken up arms. Violence is the way of life because violence is perpetrated against us, and so we retaliate. So of course, there are going to be lots of things that are going to go wrong. Within the Tamil Tigers as well. Because one of the things I talk about earlier in the book is that one of my distant relatives gets killed by the Tigers. And while I felt so upset and sad, I somehow disconnected that to the Tigers. I sort of thought, well, they killed him, my God, that's awful, and I felt really horrible. At the same time, I said, well, they are the tigers, they are the ones who are going to save us. So
he was killed because he was a member of a rival faction.
Yes, he was a member of a rival faction, and the tigers were pretty much, fighting. All the rival factions were fighting each other as well, so they got rid of them. And the tigers got rid of them. So it was one of those things, I think, as Tamils, we tended to overlook a lot of those things because we had to, because without the tigers, there was no hope for the Tamils. That's how we felt. And so, and yet despite that, I just go and join. I go and, put my hand up, and they actually didn't want to even consider me in the first time. And my friend and I tried to convince them, saying, we're going to die, we might as well do something and die. So, you should take us in because we have passion, and we even upped our age a bit. And,
you were very determined.
Yeah, we were very determined, yes, because we thought we were going to save the world, So as 17-year-old girls would think. And unfortunately, they took us in, but with a lot of warning. They did give us warning that they said that, your life wouldn't be the same. It's going to be different. And we were like, oh, yeah, we know all of that. But we didn't. And so once you're in, you constantly see the effects of violence in young people, what it does to them, how they deal with every little problem with violence. It happens in normal societies. Some individuals only know the way of violence, and in a place where violence is the way of life. So you see small conflicts, if they thought someone was a traitor, of course they're going to kill him. And things like that. And, you then start to feel uncomfortable, and then, of course, the enemy will do something to you, and then you think, well, since they're doing this to us, we'll just have to, get on and kill them or fight with them, So it's just this constant justification. And then I think something very important happened to me, when, first I see a little bit of violence within the group, and then my friend dies with so many other people around me, all my comrades. And I think that just sort of broke me and suddenly shook me into reality. And I felt, well, people keep going to die. They're going to die, and nothing good is going to come out of this. And I think that's the realization I came to after she died, after I watched her die right in front of me. And I think it's funny, something like that had to happen for you to wake up. And I still endured because there was no choice. I couldn't go back home because the army had taken territory, and by this time we were fighting the Indian peacekeeping forces. The Tigers were fighting the Indian peacekeeping forces. So I had to go and live in the jungle with the Tigers, and then again, of course, there's another murder within the group, and I think I just finally went, this is just not something that I can live with. And of course there was other things as well, not just that, but also added was, starvation, we had no shoes, wearing the same clothes for 8 months by that time, didn't have a shower. It was just dreadful, you had nowhere to sleep, and I just couldn't cope. That was my thing. There were lots of other young people who just lived through all of that, and unfortunately died eventually, but I just couldn't cope, and they let me go.
You were quite lucky that they let you go.
Well, to me at that time it seemed a normal thing. I could go ask them saying I'm just going, and then they said, well, that's fine, just be careful, we can't look after you. But then later on there was forced recruitment and all of those things that I read in your book as well. So.
And it was early on, and you were treated with you were given some special treatment. As a young woman, you were one of the first young women to be part of the combat part of the movement, and also you were very middle class, and so you were treated with some kid gloves in some ways.
Well, I'm embarrassed to sort of admit to that because you sort of think, they sort of they treat you like, oh, you can't do this, you can't cope, are you all right? That sort of thing. And one of the funniest things that we didn't realize it then, but in hindsight, that when we joined the Tigers, most of the girls would be sent to a barracks because by that time the first group of girls had been trained in India and brought to Sri Lanka. And so if you joined, you will be actually sent to live with them for a while before you were sent to training. Whereas with my friend and I, they just sent us to this fisherman's hut to live with them for a while. And we thought, why are they sending us here? Maybe they don't like us. Maybe they think, they'll leave us here and they'll forget us. But in hindsight, we realized it was just a test to see whether we could just go and live with them and see whether we could cope. And we might say, oh, well, can't cope with this, we're going back home kind of thing. Which nearly came because it was just difficult. But Arjanthi, my friend, who kept saying to me, this is a test, we've got to, get through this. And it was nothing compared to what was coming. But but they were kind. They were ordinary young people. It's a funny thing. People look at young people as terrorists. I guess they are. They do terrorist acts, but they're just young kids who just decided one day they're going to go and save the world and picked up guns. And, you lived with them day to day, they're just normal. And you would have come across a lot of them, And sometimes people say to me, well, if you're a former tiger, how come you look like this? I'm like, what? You want me to wear army camouflage and walk with an AK in the suburbs of Sydney? It's just to prove, But we were just ordinary people who end up in extraordinary situations.
Yeah, I felt that very much when I met a lot of tigers and got to know them, that, I kind of consciously made the decision that I wouldn't judge their choice to take up arms, because I don't think that you can have the right to do that unless you've lived that kind of life. I mean, if you brought up in, like I was in London, and you have a peaceful life and you can expect a future, you can't judge somebody else who takes up arms and chooses armed struggle. It's impossible to know what it's like that would drive actually quite conservative people. Really not rebellious in any sense. To tip them over the edge to that point is impossible really to understand emotionally. I mean, you can go through the various triggers that different people have been through in their personal lives, but I don't think you can really judge that properly as an outsider.
Because to give up, the comfort of your home, because I've had a loving family, a good home, and we could have just, my mum said we're getting out and we're going down south until the war is over. I could have just done that. But you sort of, especially at that age, you feel a greater sense of responsibility, that you think that if everyone chipped in, we could do this. And being 17, I guess you don't have a sense of time. I thought if I just joined and helped them out, we might be able to attain Tamil, which is the separate state that we wanted, within a year, or two. I thought it will be just like that. But once you're there, you realize it's going to be prolonged, people are going to die, and this is just not the way it works out. So.
Can I ask you, since we're at a writers' festival, can I ask you, Niromi, about the process of writing the book? What was it like to write the book? When did you write it? And why is it published now?
Well, funnily enough, I wrote this soon after I left the Tigers. So when I was in a boarding school in India with the Irish nuns, the only way to let yourself be, free is to just write down your thoughts. And for me, especially have come from such a horrible few years and suddenly be put into this environment where it was a very controlled, very posh boarding school, I had to sort of... I felt like I had all these memories that not many people could relate to. I did tell my friends then, but, they didn't understand. They were just 15-year-old girls who were bewildered, And I also felt a sense of responsibility for those people that had died, especially my friend. I felt like I knew her last days, her last hour, and I'm the one who has to put it all down so that it's not forgotten. And I must say, I just would write every night in Tamil. That's my first language. So I wrote like a mad woman. And it really helped me at the end, because when I finished it, I just felt this sense of relief just overcome me, because I felt like, okay, it's there now. So I'm not going to forget, and you won't believe I had written down in so much detail. It's funny, with that young, you have a great memory. I don't now. But so I've written down things like what people said verbatim, what they wore, how they look like, that sort of detail. And then I put it away for 20 years, didn't look at it. I mean, my family wouldn't even really discuss any of these things. In Sri Lankan families, we are better not discuss things, because you've got to focus on the next thing. So, so I put it away. But in that whole time that I didn't read anything about Sri Lanka, I didn't want to know about Sri Lanka. I knew even the Prime Minister, Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was murdered at that time, supposedly by the Tigers, and that's all I knew. I didn't know who it was, what they did, nothing like that. And it's only in 2009 when the war was, like you read in Francis's book, that the refugees started coming to Australia. There was so much misinformation. You couldn't avoid it after that. I couldn't sort of ignore it. And then I had to start reading about what was happening in Sri Lanka. And the refugees were coming here and people had all of these stories about, these are not real refugees, send them back, go back to where they came from, that sort of thing. And I felt it's because nobody understood about Sri Lanka, nobody connected to anyone in a personal level, and it's all the stuff that they read is in newspapers, which is very clinical, and also academic textbooks perhaps. But I thought people just need to hear somebody's personal story of why they joined a movement like that, why they then fled their country and come to Australia. So events happened in such a way that I didn't go to a publisher. The publisher came to me and they said, can we put this book together? And I had to then translate it into English. And it was, honestly, for all that time, I hadn't felt the emotion of it. And it's only while I was translating, the whole thing just came back to me. And I started to process the whole thing. And you wouldn't believe, I'll be sitting at my keyboard and typing. My family would see me just bawling my eyes out, day in, day out, because by that time you knew what had happened after so many years of struggle, what the Tamils have come to. But in a way it was cathartic. It's funny, 2 years of writing the book and I still can't, you just relive it every time. And I understood what happened to people. And then I was looking for updates about what happened to the people that I left behind, because the guilt of having survived them is what made me feel terrible all these years. And everybody had died eventually, at different, and you see it in the last chapter. So it was heartbreaking. And it took a lot of guts, because you read the book and you see everything. I've just poured my heart out to you. It was difficult, but it had to be done.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly raw book, I think. You've exposed your soul to the world to read, which, is incredibly courageous.
Or stupid.
Yeah. Maybe.
The thin line between the two.
The connection between the 2009 arrival of asylum seekers, obviously that's been a lot of my work. Francis, I'm interested in your take on this. Late last year, some senior opposition figures from Australia went to Sri Lanka on what they called a fact-finding mission. And they returned to Australia saying that the civil war was over, that the Sri Lankan government was not persecuting its citizens, and that Sri Lankans who arrived by boat should be basically turned around before they were able to access Australian law. Is the war over? Is it safe?
No. I mean, the war's not over. The fighting is over. I mean, the guns are silent, but none of the underlying root causes of this decades-long conflict have been addressed. In fact, if anything, things for Tamils in the north and the east have got worse, because much as there was this love-hate relationship with the Tigers, I mean, they loved them when they stood up for them, they hated them when they took their kids or their money, there's no buffer against the army now. The Tamils are it's completely one-sided. All the power lies with the army. So what we've seen since the end of the war is, apart from the actual end, there was a great deal of torture and summary execution and rape. But it wasn't that was just a sort of brief period of revenge at the end. That has continued to this day. So last week in London, I met a woman from Sri Lanka, an asylum seeker, who her two younger brothers had been forcibly recruited by the Tigers. They disappeared. They went away hand in hand. They were so young. Her father was beaten to death, left in a ditch. She was put in prison and gang raped for several weeks. She came out, she went into hiding, and her mother said, "Don't come home, and they'll be looking for you." The next day she got a phone call. They said, "Come back to the village, your mother and sister are dead." She went back, she found their skeletons on a bed of ash. I mean, they burnt the whole house. She was so distraught she didn't hide. They picked her up. 47 days she was continuously beaten, starved, and gang raped, including with her head in a bucket of water. I mean, appalling treatment. Her mother's cousin, basically sold the land, bribed the police, got her out, took her across Sri Lanka and popped her on a boat, much in the way that, decades earlier Niromi got on a boat to India. And she went in the boat still wearing the same clothes stained in blood and semen. It was appalling. And that's a girl sitting in London who's now suicidal. And this happened in November 2012. So if you tell her that the war is over, that's utter rubbish.
The fact-finding mission occurred in September.
Yeah, so this is at the same time, basically, this was going on. And is going on again and again. Human Rights Watch recently issued a report about sexual abuse of men and women in Sri Lanka, and several of the cases were from last year. And, rape and sexual abuse is such a stigma, well, in any society, and especially in Tamil society, that if you can document eight cases from 2012 amongst asylum seekers, then that's the tip of the iceberg. We know that the army has increased in size, it's involved in every aspect of life. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a report recently, because this is going to be discussed in Geneva, and she talked about how ordinary civilians in the north and the east who went through this war, don't even have the right to mourn. They cannot hold small gatherings, religious ceremonies to mourn the dead, and that is really the most basic of all things. And we're talking 4 years after a war in which tens of thousands of people died. Almost every family in the northeast would have lost somebody. And so not to allow them to mourn, to go to church or the temple and mourn, is so basic. I mean, that doesn't talk about a war being over or everything being fine and progress. The progress is infrastructure development. There's a lot of roads being built, and that's because it benefits, Sinhalese contractors, to be honest, and businesses from Colombo. Tamils are not benefiting from that.
And I think this whole thing about, not allowing mourning because my friend's grave was destroyed and army barracks was built right on top of it. It's sort of saying that, they don't acknowledge the fact that they are human beings. They fought a war and perished, but it's to erase everything that's about the Tigers. And I think, and also the unfortunate thing here is that all Tamils are seen as Tigers. There is no separate identity. Them don't even agree with the Tigers, and yet it's seen as a collective identity, and because of that, the whole. So even if you mourn for your own relative, your family member who's died and had nothing to do with the Tigers, the fact that the act of mourning because they died during the war is seen as you're mourning for the Tigers. So that's part of the reason why I think they just don't allow it. That's denied.
Well, there's a total denial of what happened.
Yeah,
There's an erasing of history going on in the northeast, erasing even the ancient history, discovering ancient Buddhist, sites and using Sinhalese names for what is a Tamil area, settling Sinhalese people in the northeast so there will be no Tamil concentration of population. There's some real kind of re-engineering of these areas going on at the moment, and that's quite disturbing. So to say that there's no reason for a person to flee, or to say that everything's improving in Sri Lanka, flies in the face of every single major international human rights organization's reports. We're talking about all of them, categorize detail what's happening and say that it's getting worse. The UN itself says that. The High Commissioner's report is very damning of what's happened in Sri Lanka. So if you talk about progress, it's progress in terms of building things. That's not about people's lives, and it doesn't benefit the people who survived the war at all.
Yeah, sure. Just before I open the floor to the audience, I just want to sort of step out from Sri Lanka and look at a bigger picture. Francis, you write that this story matters because Sri Lanka is no longer just a country whose people did bad things to each other. It's an unexpected piece of the jigsaw of the discourse on global terrorism. Can you talk briefly about that?
Well, the Tigers were prescribed in many countries around the world, 40-odd countries, as a terrorist group. And the Sri Lankan government used that language of the global war on terror to win support. They said, okay, you've done it, and you've talked about, used the same sort of terminology in Iraq or Afghanistan. This is our war on terror, so you should support us, and you should turn a blind eye to what goes wrong. And they still say now that Sri Lanka is the only country in the world that has defeated terrorism militarily. That's a nonsense, obviously, because if you defeat it militarily and you don't address the reasons for an ethnic conflict, then you leave the problem festering. And if you also have this attitude of triumphalism and sort of lack of any kind of power sharing or concession at the end of the war, then you really set yourself up for a repeat of the war. And obviously that's of great concern, that in the decades to come, another generation may feel they need to take up arms again because there's nothing else for them. There's absolutely no other option. But yes, this language of terrorists and defeating terrorism was used. And the Sri Lankan state now exports its model. They call it the Sri Lankan option. So other countries have sent, and many of them, including Western countries, have sent delegates to this annual conference that the Sri Lankan military hold, where they teach military delegates the lessons of counter-terrorism that they learned from this war. But this is the Sri Lankan option is really a method of scorched earth tactics, massive human rights violations, war crimes, crimes against humanity, failing to distinguish between civilians and combatants, bombing deliberately and repeatedly hospitals, bombing food queues, shelling concentrations of civilians. They've created no-fire zones where they said civilians should gather, and then they deliberately targeted those areas. And there are international witnesses to some of that happened in January 2009, UN people who were actually under fire, who were lucky to escape with their lives. So there are massive, massive violations of international law, which the UN experts who looked at this said basically posed a challenge to the entire regime of law, the way this war was fought. So there's an element to which we as the international community, we in the world, ought to care about this, even if we don't care about Sri Lanka, which I do, of course. But even if you don't, you should be worried about it, because why do we have laws about war? If we can allow a country to breach all of them like this, then it sends a signal to other countries that, hey, you can do the same thing.
Sure, yeah. I wonder if there's people in the audience who would like to ask our authors questions.
I've got a question for Niromi about how children can be integrated into Western society when they've lived through what you've lived through. I mean, I found it really touching because I have a Sri Lankan background, but my family didn't experience any of that. So, and I work with children now, and I just wonder, we have migrants come here, but I don't think we give them enough support, and we expect them to integrate and be Aussies. But with all that trauma, especially for children, how do you become normal after that?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think there are many ways that people are addressing that. But for me, personally, because I was still fairly young, I mean, more naive than young, actually, by the time when I came to Australia, the best thing that happened to me was that I was just given goals ahead of me. My parents were just wonderful that way, although I didn't think of it at that time that they were that good, because I used to think, they never asked me a single question about what happened while I was there. They didn't talk about it at all, and I used to resent them for it. But as an adult, I look back and think that's the best thing they did, because they didn't let me dwell on it too much straight away. So they just kept giving me goals. Like they said, you need to finish your high school, then you need to go to university, and just keep planning for your life. So, and I think that sort of bought me time and something to focus on away from that environment. Because having been removed from a terrible environment like that, if you start to then focus backwards, you can't move forward. And I think that is what I think children need. Of course, when they're young, they are able to focus what's in front of them, unlike adults who tend to hold back to old memories. And I think they should be allowed to express themselves at the same time, but in their own time, not forced counselling. I don't believe in that, personally, because it wouldn't have worked for me. I would have just become a wreck. And also, expression through little things like art and writing, that I think that just sort of allows a person in their own choice of self-expression. And also, it's important that they integrate. I think one of the things that I was talking to David and Francis about before time, that I personally would have not benefited if I were to be cocooned when I arrived, not sent to live with my community and made me feel comfortable in that setup. Whereas I needed to get away from that. I needed to form my own identity in a new place, and I needed to learn the good things about this country and what it offers me. Because, of course, in my country, I felt they were trying to kill me. I wasn't worthy of living. Whereas here, I've been, looked at as a human being, given a chance to live. So I needed to adapt all those good things and learn about this culture so that I can form my own identity, take the good things from my past as well as the good things from here. And so that is what had helped me to move on and integrate. So I don't think that, personally, that's to me a better solution than trying to keep them comfortable in that old setup. Hope.
Well, I suppose I wanted to first say that I don't have any extra grime whatsoever, but just wanted to convey some observations that I made when I was in Sri Lanka at the time when these massacres were probably occurring. But I was in the southeast, where it wasn't really a continuing problem as far as the government was concerned. But I saw what seemed to be a very systematic control mechanism in play, where there was long new highways built with clearing of jungle on either side to 70 metres, and soldier centres every 200 metres along this road. And everybody had a mobile phone. So it seemed to me that it would be impossible to operate a guerrilla activity under those circumstances. And I thought, someone's thought this all through, and I just wonder whether Francis would comment whether, is it really the government that has orchestrated all this, or have they had consultants come in and say, how do you eradicate terrorists from the country? There are companies in the world that do this kind of thing, bring in advisors and so on. So does it go back to something more insidious?
Well, if they've had, sorry, my microphone on. If they've had foreign consultants assisting them, I don't know about it. I mean, it's possible. It's just not openly known, or, I don't know about that. I think they had quite a bit of help from the kind of countries they bought arms from. So there was some training American Marines trained some of the Sri Lankan soldiers. They also gave human rights training, which didn't work very well. There's a lot of reports or sort of rumours about Indian military assistance for them. But I think, the overall strategy of the war was devised by, I would say, probably by the Sri Lankan military and, the top military generals. And clearly they had planned this. But I think even they were quite surprised by how easy, in a way, it turned out to be to defeat the Tigers, because, there was a myth that Prabhakaran and the Tiger leaders were invincible, because he had achieved an enormous amount in a few decades. And he had, from the time when Niromi was with them, they had AK-47s and grenades, right? And then by the period I'm writing about, they had tanks, they had an air force, they had a very sophisticated naval unit. They were huge. They were like a conventional army. So, the Sri Lankan forces didn't think they could actually defeat them that fast. So when they did start to fall, it was quite a surprise to the Sri Lankan army how quickly they disintegrated, really.
You mentioned Syria, and it seems to me that the recent conflicts in Syria and Libya got a lot more media attention and Western military intervention. Just wondering if you could comment on why we got that level of attention in those conflicts, but Sri Lanka seemed to almost be ignored.
Yes, well, that's something I think about a lot. I think there's some really basic reasons, like Syria, you saw the refugees and Libya pouring over national borders and coming out with stories of what had happened to them. But you have to remember Sri Lanka's an island, so people simply couldn't get out because the Navy controlled the sea line as well. So when everybody was crushed into this tiny portion of land, eventually they ended up on a minuscule spit of sandy beachhead. And they couldn't get into the sea very much and disappear and go to India. It just wasn't possible. They got picked up by the Navy if they managed to find a boat. So I think that's one of the major reasons. And then I think the kind of propaganda war fought by the Sri Lankan state was, very sophisticated and very successful. And, geopolitically, they convinced a whole range of countries, India, Pakistan, Israel, Iran, China, America, all of them really signed off on the idea that the Tigers were terrorists, and therefore I think the assumption was that if there were bad things done during the war, it was most likely to be the terrorists that did it and not the army. And so, when they started, the UN started to get reports about war crimes committed by the army. They didn't quite kind of match it up with reality, with their expectations of a war on terror. So there are a whole lot of reasons. The lack of witnesses, the lack of access to the war zone, that was really important as well. And I think then, of course, people don't understand the very complicated politics of Sri Lanka. It's not strategically so important. It doesn't have oil. It's not an Islamic threat. And it is very complicated. It is very interesting, the politics, but it is quite difficult to understand unless you've lived there, unless you've met the people personally, unless you get to know them. It's quite hard to follow it. So I think all those reasons meant that it didn't get the attention it should have got. But it's not too late.
Does it also reflect something of the failure of the media? Is there something about a fearlessness that isn't present in the contemporary media? I know that there are journalists and media organisations that put their bodies on the line, but somehow they didn't.
But it's ironic, that the journalist who was killed in Syria, Mary Colvin, whom we all, miss terribly, she was the one that smuggled her way into the Vani, into this area of Sri Lanka in 2001 and lost her eye. It's significant that it's the same person, really, that tried to tell both humanitarian stories, both stories of civilians suffering in a war. But there aren't very many war correspondents like her. And I think the problem with the media, yes, the way they reported this war, they would say, on the one hand, the Tigers say so many people killed, captured, lost this territory. On the other hand, the Sri Lankan army says this, and we have no independent corroboration of either side. And so that's not really good enough after a while, because then you just have no idea what's happening. You don't tell anybody. You're missing a major story of tens of thousands of people being killed, and you're saying on the one hand this, on the other hand that. That's not the truth. That's just citing two sources, really. And I think because Sri Lanka is quite small, most of the main media organisations are headquartered in Delhi, as you probably know, and then they would have local, often Sinhalese reporters, so one side in Colombo feeding them information. And those people were threatened. There were a huge number of journalists receiving death threats, fleeing the country. 50, 60 journalists fled during that time. And one of them was killed, others, Tamil journalists killed. I mean, it was really a full-on frontal attack on journalists. So they weren't in a position to challenge authority at all and to feed that information to foreign journalists or other people who came in. So the information just didn't really seep out properly. I think that probably answers your question as to how journalists failed. And then, we all move on to the next story. It's very rare that you have the luxury to go back and look at one that happened before. So in that sense, I've been very lucky.
Sure.
As we've heard this afternoon, there's a very strong emphasis on education in the Tamil culture, and certainly in earlier times, Tamils dominated the bureaucracy, or the senior positions in government were held by Tamils. I just wondered what the situation is today. Have they been completely excluded, or are they gradually coming back?
Oh, I don't think they're going back. Because there was a huge brain drain, because when, the 1983 anti-Tamil pogrom took place, most of the Tamils just fled. So especially those who could migrate were the educated ones. So they've all, they are the ones who formed the diaspora. Whereas it's the poor and, the destitute that were left behind. So there's still the emphasis on education there, but it's difficult, they're oppressed. And, of course, if you're, you're looking at starving and education, you're going to, first your basic needs need to be met. And I think that's the problem, because in position of power, there are hardly any Tamils, I'd say.
Yeah, I'd say that one of the things that's amazing is you see in 2008, even beginning 2009, when the war was pretty full on, you still see video and pictures of little school children in uniform going to school, almost studying in bunkers, and, displaced schools, but still functioning, because that emphasis on education is so, so important. And one of the things we were talking about earlier is one of the people in my book, a mother, she escaped, she crawled, she went through this appalling war, her 9-year-old lost half her body weight, she was starved. They were very lucky to get out alive. They crawled under barbed wire to escape the detention centre. They got, by the skin of their teeth, they got out to London. They got to London. If it was me, I'd say to my kids, okay, go and play in the garden, take it easy for a year, it doesn't matter, you've got to learn English, do it slowly. She was like, no way, we have this exam at 11 where you do this, well, actually younger than 11, but it's your major exam to get into secondary school. So she was like, no, sit down, study, you've got to get into a good school. I was like, wow.
Very Sri Lankan.
It's very Sri Lankan. The Sri Lankans in the audience are laughing, but it is quite incredible that people do that. And most Tamils around the world have extra school on Saturday, where they, Tamil school, where they reinforce all this learning in Tamil and in English. So it's really impressive, actually, that emphasis on education. But in terms of the civil service, being Tamil, I remember once when I lived in Sri Lanka, we wanted to look for a Tamil speaker in Sri Lankan Airlines. There'd been a big attack. And we rang them and we said, have you got anyone who speaks Tamil or is Tamil to speak to us? Anybody at any level. They couldn't find a single Tamil. There was one in Dubai. That was it. Nobody in Colombo or in the island who spoke Tamil. So it gives you an idea of how bad there just aren't any Tamils, in the main, that was the state carrier.
Yes. We've just got a few more minutes, so we'll try and be brief. And
Just firstly would like to state that people may have noticed the aircraft going over before. I heard kids going, wow, and for me my reaction was a shudder. I'm a Rotary Peace Scholar and I'm also a World Peace Clown, and I have created peace education. My interest is very much the future, where we move from here to the future. We all do focus on education, but what we don't tend to focus on is conflict resolution within education. The program I've written is called Real Hope, which is an acronym for responsibility, empathy, awareness, love, honesty, oneness, peace, enjoyment, and the last one is service. When I've tried to move this into schools, there is lots of barriers here in Australia, given the focus on numeracy and literacy as we're seeing more important, yet we're not noticing the social disintegration in our own country, and where we also become very competitive through our sports rather than teaching cooperation and not glorifying war through movies, but actually starting to promote peace as a real thing. My question is, what would be your response to creating a culture of peace within Sri Lanka?
I think, first of all, we need to address what had happened and take responsibility for it. Because as long as there's denial of what happened with thousands and thousands of people, both sides actually, I mean, even on the Sinhalese side, there's so many people who died throughout this years and years of conflict. All of that need to be acknowledged, and there has to be accountability. And I think without that, it's really hard for people to move forward. Because if somebody comes and robs your house, you know, kill your family or whatever, you can't just say, well, you know, just get over it and move on. It's not going to work. You've got to address it, and, you know, people need to see justice. People need to see that the law and order is in the society so that they feel safe to move forward, and then, you know, work for reconciliation. To me, that's the only way that is peace, real peace.
Can I just leave that, because I want to pick that up just in the last minute or two, but maybe we can get one more question in before we pick that up.
Mine is just a comment. Niromi, thank you so much for deciding to actually publish your book after 20 years. I've never been to Sri Lanka. I'm of Tamil origin, born and raised in Malaysia. My parents are both born in Sri Lanka. I've often heard stories about Jaffna and all that, but often wondered what is it that made people, especially girls, join the Tamil Tigers. But having read your book, I have an insight, and sometimes think that if I was in your position, I would have probably done the same. So thank you for writing the book.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you for your lovely comment.
Maybe we'll try one more. We'll have to be quick, though.
Okay, it'll be quick. Niromi, one of the things that intrigues me always when warring states is where the armament comes from, in an ever-increasing Tamil area where you started with Kalashnikovs and ended up with all that armament. Do you know where and who was supplying all this stuff? And perhaps either one of you could answer that in that case.
Thank you. I think probably Frances, with her research as a journalist, would know more about this, because I used to be quite astounded the amount of weapons that came in, and a lot of them would be brand new. You know, they were greased in packets, and they just, you know, especially the war when it broke out with the Indian peacekeeping forces after the Tigers have supposedly surrendered arms. All these new weapons just arrived from nowhere, and you sort of think, wow, who is supplying this stuff? And you know, obviously there are weapon smugglers, weapon suppliers, and most of them obviously come from countries that produce these things. Russia, China, you know, you name it. We had G3s, which are German, and AK-47s, Russian. So all of this stuff, obviously, you know, on the surface, everybody's talking peace, and behind this, there is all of this push that goes on undercurrent. And it's a huge business, obviously, and ordinary people pay the price for it. But I'll let Frances really answer your question.
You answer it very quickly, Frances.
Okay, well, I mean, people who've studied it suggest that the Tigers raised about $200 million a year, and, you know, they owned legitimate businesses, ships and so on, and they bought weapons primarily in the markets, black markets of the Far East, and then brought them in by ship across the ocean, would sort of park the ship offshore, as it were, and then have little boats unload it. Of course, the Indian Navy and the Sri Lankan Navy watched that and tried to, you know, hit them when they did that, but I don't think they had, you know, the height of the war, they weren't short of weapons. And then they captured a lot from the Sri Lankan army as well. So, yeah, they had a lot of very sophisticated weapons. They built some mines and bombs and grenades, you know, locally they made those. And one of the guys in my book was a Tiger who was an arms manufacturer, and he was a Norwegian Tamil. He spent time on the internet researching the latest things, you know, learning from it, writing the shopping lists for the arms buyers. So they were, you know, they could sit there on the net choosing what weapons they wanted, and they would come by ship a few months later.
Even the time I was there were a lot of guys who didn't have an arm, because their arms being blown off while they were trying to manufacture weapons in backyard factories, so that was quite common.
The Tigers are credited with the Jumping Johnny mine.
Oh, yes, that's right.
They're quite innovative.
We've run out of time. What I'd like to just finish with is just a final. If Francis, you're happy to read the final paragraphs from your book. So what you've done is you quote an aid worker who says, "The war is not over in Sri Lanka. You don't solve these problems on the battlefield," and then you commentate a little bit more about it. So just the last few paragraphs.
Humiliation was heaped on top of unimaginable suffering, so that Tamils experienced extreme loss, shame, and helplessness. Yes, there were many unsung heroes in the final phase of the war, but there were also plenty of Tamils who abandoned their friends to save themselves and are now haunted by that choice. Denied space in which to assert themselves politically or socially, they're now part of what psychologists term a massively traumatized group. After Iraq, Afghanistan, and Darfur, Sri Lanka probably has the highest number of casualties of any conflict this century, and yet few have heard of it. It's unrealistic to expect survivors just to put the war behind them, forget the past, and move on. Without acknowledging the truth, it will be easy for radical politicians to exploit the collective rage. The risk is, the next time, it won't just be the Sinhalese they hate, but also the international community that abandoned them.
Niromi and Francis, thanks very much for the session, and thank you all for coming along and listening.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.